Dr. Erica, another 2 minutes to start. We are already live on YouTube.
Okay, sounds great.
Yes.
Manila, while we're waiting, could you give me permission to share my screen so I can share my slides?
Yes, I'll do that. Yes.
Thank you.
We have, Dr. Erica, we have made you the co-host. They're down there, share screen.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. 1 minute to go.
Hello.
Yeah, your screen is on now. We can see, Dr. Erica, we can see your screen.
Great. Perfect.
Yeah, perfect. So you can minimize for some time till we start, and then you can share the screen. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yes. Good evening, everybody, and warm greetings to you all from Bangalore Sahodaya School Complex Association. We have Dr. Erica Lemke, who is the interim dean of the College of Education, University of Missouri, and professor and past chair, Department of Special Education at MISO. We are really delighted to have her here. And for her early in the morning at 7 o'clock, and she is with us from US, I request Dr. Dakshani Khanna to please present a profile to the participant. Over to Dakshani, madam.
Thank you so much, Ms. Manila, for giving me the opportunity. Dr. Erica Lemke, it is, I mean, I don't know whether I'm pronouncing your name properly or not. Is it Lemke?
Perfect. Yes, thank you.
So much. It's indeed my privilege to introduce you, Dr. Erica Lemke, for this important webinar to share her insights and wisdom. Basically, when I looked at her Twitter handle, everywhere she proudly has said that, yes, I am completely with children with learning disabilities, which is a great thing. And I think that is, we are proud of having you here today. We are very sure that your expertise in this subject will help us to understand learning difficulties, disabilities better, and how to monitor the progress of those children using curriculum-based measurements. This will definitely help us because CBSE directives also talk about inclusive education and inclusive classrooms, and also the national education policy that has come out has a lot of importance given to these areas. I will straight away go to Dr. Erica's profile. Dr. Erica Lemke is the interim dean of the College of Education at the Universities of Missouri and is a professor and the past chair of Department of Special Education at MISO, a position she has served for 5 years. Dr. Lemke came to MISO in 2003 following the completion of her PhD at the University of Minnesota and is approaching her 18th year in the college. She's also served as a chair of the policy committee of the college education, in addition to serving on a variety of other college and campus committees. Dr. Lemke has participated in both leadership development programs at MU and also steering committee member of the group. And she's also a graduate of Harvard Management Development Program of 2019. Her research interests include assessment and intervention for students at risk with disabilities, and her current federally funded grants are directed towards teacher and schools professional development learning. She has participated as a principal investigator or a co-PI on close of 10 million US dollars federally funded projects. Dr. Lemke provides professional learning to dozens of school districts across the state of Missouri and throughout US, with over 200 local, state, and international presentations. We are proud and we are privileged to have you here, Dr. Lemke, and we're looking forward for your insights and wisdom. Thank you so much for being here, that too early in the morning. From behalf of all of us, a heartiest welcome to you, and we are looking forward for your session. Over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that nice greeting. And I would say the same to you. Thank you so much for joining what is late in your day. And so really appreciate it. I'm just thrilled with the number of people that are signing on. And you know, we have had, our college has had a great relationship with the schools in your consortium. We've been able, in fact, one of my colleagues in special education was able to join you last summer, Dr. Chad Rose in India. Dr. Gabrielle Malfatti, our international engagement coordinator in the college, has had a long relationship with your schools in India. And so I hope that when COVID releases a bit, that I might be able to come and visit some of your schools, or have some of you come and visit us in Missouri. I've done some work internationally in South Korea, and I've been to Cuba and a few other countries, but I haven't had the opportunity to visit India. So I hope I'll be able to do that in the future. So again, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides right now, and we'll go ahead and get started. I think the best thing to do if you have questions as we go is to go ahead and put those in the chat. And if, because we only have an hour today, I want to really maximize our time. And so I'll try to answer some of those questions at the end, or Manila can save the chat for me and I can respond later. I can follow up with you by email as well. So you can certainly do that. My email is here as well. And so feel free to follow up with me if you have particular questions. I really appreciate that nice introduction. And I believe I followed you back this morning on Twitter. So thank you so much for that. As you mentioned, I do know that this is a recent change to your national education policies to provide the opportunity to work more with students with learning disabilities in inclusive settings. And so I was thrilled to see that. I hope this information is helpful for you today. I know that in the US, we are definitely, you know, in many versions of online learning. And so I'm assuming that you may be the same. And there are some resources for using some of the materials we're going to talk about today in an online setting. And so you should follow up with me, or I can send some resources to Manila after this for some online approaches after the session today. So I'm going to mainly be talking about curriculum-based measurement, or CBM, today to monitor academic progress. This is a real passion of mine. It's been really the focus of my work since my graduate program. My advisor, Dr. Stan Dino, was sort of the historical originator of CBM, and From my time as a teacher, I was a special education teacher in elementary schools for 6 years. From my time teaching all the way through to my time in my graduate program, and now in my research and in my professional development, CBM and progress monitoring have really been a focus. And so I'm happy to talk about it today. In the time we have, this will be just really kind of it'll feel maybe like a quick overview. There's a lot to share. And so I hope that I might have the opportunity to share even more at a later time. So just to get started, today in the time that we have, I'll give you a little background and introduction to CBM, curriculum-based measurement. From here on out, I'm just going to call it CBM, if that's okay. And I'm going to talk in particular about how to use this for progress monitoring. The progress monitoring piece is really important because for students with learning disabilities or students at risk, it's very important that we're following how they're doing, that we're tracking their progress on a regular basis. And CBM is an ideal tool to use in that progress monitoring. Finally, I'll spend just a tiny bit of time at the end on how we use that data that we've collected to make better database decisions about student progress. So progress monitoring broadly is for students who are at risk or with learning disabilities. And we use it because we can't assume that the instruction we're providing is automatically meeting students' needs. We hope that the practices we're using are evidence-based and that they meet the needs of many students, but we're not sure unless we're tracking or following or monitoring their progress on a regular basis. So we need to monitor their progress in areas like reading, which is going to be my focus today, and other academic areas. And I'm not going to talk as much, hardly at all, about other areas like mathematics, writing today, but I don't want that to suggest that those areas aren't important or that we can't use CBM in those areas. We can. Actually, there are nicely developed measures in those areas. But today, just to kind of narrow, I'm really going to talk about reading. We need to monitor progress on a regular basis. And I'm going to suggest to you today that that should be weekly in order to determine whether students are on track to meeting the goals that we've set for them. I've had some great fortune to have several studies funded by the U.S. Department of Education to study progress monitoring in areas like reading, writing, middle school mathematics. So looking forward to talking to you a little bit more about that. So CBM provides a very efficient way to monitor student progress. And maybe one of the most important pieces is that it's data that you can be confident in. The measures are valid, reliable. They have what we call technical adequacy, which just means that they've been studied, they've been scrutinized. The data that is collected is data that's been utilized with students who are at risk, students who have learning disabilities. And so you can be confident that the measures that have been created, that they will provide you good information, valid information for your students. We take weekly data, so measures are given weekly, and graph that data to create a visual representation. And I'll show you in just a little bit what a graph might look like for a particular student. But we use that graph data to make important instructional decisions for students. So just to kind of recap briefly, CBM is a simple form of repeated measurement that documents growth over time for students. And we set goals for students, and then we document this growth over time, and we actually compare it to the goals that were set in order to make decisions about how students are performing in their current instructional current set of instructional procedures. Today, I'm not going to talk as much about intervention. So there are lots of validated reading interventions, for instance, or writing interventions we can use to help that progress grow even more. Today, I'm going to really talk just about the progress monitoring piece of it. So curriculum-based measurement was really first studied at the University of Minnesota almost 50 years ago now. I know that seems like crazy to think that, you know, it was first studied in the early 70s and now here we are. But suffice it to say, there's a strong degree of research for it. As I mentioned before, it has really strong technical characteristics. And one really terrific site that I would encourage you to go to find out more about curriculum-based measurement, about intervention, is the site for the National Center on Intensive Intervention. And you can see the website here. It's intensiveintervention.org. And on that site, they have many tools charts where they provide more information about interventions, about academic progress measures, about behavioral progress measures. So I encourage you to go to that site. Again, it's right here, intensiveintervention.org. That's a great place for you to go, National Center on Intensive Intervention, particularly as you move into supporting students who have learning disabilities more frequently in your classes, as you support online learning. There are many resources on this site for both of those things. They've put a lot of sample lessons up, so I encourage you to take a look at that. So as we consider how to use CBM, there's really two ways that we can use it. We can use it for screening, or sometimes we call that benchmarking, where we give measures to students 3 times a year. Usually in a typical school year, we would give like fall, winter, spring. I know some of you have perhaps year-long school, and so this might be slightly different. But typically at 3 points during the year, we give everyone in the school a short battery of measures. So 2 or 3 reading measures that are very short in length, you know, usually 1 to 2 minutes in length. And we get data from the entire school, entire building, to get a better sense of who might be at risk. I'm going to focus mostly today on the second use for CBM, which is for progress monitoring. For progress monitoring, students who are struggling, or who are at risk, or who are identified with learning disabilities are given these short assessments on a more frequent basis. And this progress monitoring, it's a narrower group of students that we give progress monitoring measures to, and we're usually giving these measures weekly. When I say measures, I'm going to give you lots of examples of what these measures are, but we're choosing one measure per student for progress monitoring. So for screening, we might be giving, you know, 2 or 3 measures for screening, but for progress monitoring, we're narrowing in. Teachers have so much on their plates. They have so much to do, as you know. It would be hard for us to ask them to do, you know, like implement many, many more assessments. So we're asking them to use one measure. These are typically in reading, 1 minute in length, and these are given once a week to each student who is identified with learning disabilities. So why do we use this progress monitoring data? Well, one, we want to estimate rates of student improvement. So we want to get a sense of how quickly students are improving. And we want to be able to compare how they're improving to the goals that we've set for them. Also, unfortunately, we know that some students won't demonstrate adequate progress. So we want to be able to identify early on who might not be making progress. And we want to be able to provide some additional intervention or instruction to those students so that we can get them back on track, if you will. So we can get them back making progress. We want to be able to compare the different types of instruction and intervention we're providing to make sure that we're finding the best one for each student with a learning disability. I think, you know, as many of you have probably found, students with learning disabilities have very individualized needs, and we might say it is not a one size fits all. We have to identify the program that works best for each student. In order to determine whether that program is working, we need to progress monitor to make sure we're on, that the student is on his or her way to meeting those long-term outcomes. So progress monitoring gives us a sense of that. We use CBM for progress monitoring because we can monitor student progress throughout the school year. And we give students these reading measures. I'm going to show you these in just a second, some examples of these. We give these at regular intervals. I'm going to suggest today that for students with learning disabilities, we really need to be giving these weekly. In other cases, for students who might be at risk, for students who we have determined might be struggling in reading, we might be able to give these less often. But for students at risk, we're really suggesting to teachers, and the evidence supports that we need to implement these weekly. And then teachers use that data to set goals and use that progress data to determine how students are doing toward meeting those long-term goals. As I mentioned before, these CBM measures or tests are brief and easy to administer. Most of the measures in reading are 1 minute in length. Administration is very straightforward. We're standardized in our administration, but the administration doesn't require a lot of training. And so it's something that a teacher can practice and do right away. Each time students are given a measure or a test, there are different forms. So all the forms are different, but they assess the same skill and the same difficulty level. So if you pick a level like a 4th grade level or a level 4 test, all of those tests will be similar in difficulty, but each time you give, each week, you give the student a test or a measure, that content is different. It's a new story that they read. It's a new set of sounds that they have to name. So there are different forms, maybe 20 to 30 forms of each type of CBM, and that allows teachers to give a new measure each week when they work with the student. And then most importantly, and unfortunately we won't have quite as much time to talk about this today, but teachers take that data and graph it to make decisions about instructional programs. And so I'm sure many of you have used, or your teachers in your buildings have used graphing in the past to graph like behavioral data or to graph academic data. That's a really important piece of what we ask teachers to do with CBM. We used to actually just encourage teachers to use like paper graphs even, but now we really have electronic means, whether it's Excel or some other type of electronic format. We really encourage teachers to use electronic graphing programs to help take a look at that data. What it creates is really a nice picture of student progress. That graphed data is an excellent way to communicate with parents and guardians, with other teachers, and it's a great way to communicate with the students about how they're doing in reading, for instance. So there's lots of advantages of using that graph data. So I'm going to go through the basic steps in how to use CBM for progress monitoring. I'll try to illustrate examples in these steps, and then we'll come back and kind of review the steps at the end. And so I'm just going to quickly kind of go through the steps, and then I'll slow down a little bit and I'll take each step one by one. So the first step is to decide on your level of implementation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Decide on which measures to use. As I mentioned, I'm going to focus on reading today, so I'll give you some examples of those measures. You're going to collect screening or baseline data. That's the starting point for setting a goal for a student, a progress monitoring goal. And so that's going to be your first kind of step in getting started with your graph. Determine at which level you're going to monitor a student. Many of our students with learning disabilities, as you probably know, are not necessarily achieving on grade level. And so we need to determine if we're going to use measures that are at their grade level or measures that are a little bit lower than their grade level. And I think in reading, the best way to think about that are to use measures that we feel like match the skills they need to work on. So for instance, if they're still at that early reading level where they're working on like phonemic awareness and phonics, then you're going to use early reading measures. If they're at the point when they're reading connected text, then we might be able to use oral reading fluency measures. I'll show you some examples and we can kind of talk through that. You're going to set goals for each student with whom you're working. And then you're going to decide how often you're going to progress monitor. And I'm just going to suggest right now that weekly would be a good routine to shoot for. Teachers graph that data, and then most importantly, they make instructional changes using that data. So they look at the data, they make a decision comparing the level of the data to the goal that was set, and they implement that change as it's necessary and continue to monitor. So let me slow down now and we'll go through each of these steps, but this gives you a nice kind of broad overview, a little checklist, if you will, of those basic steps in progress monitoring using CBM. So the first decision, you're going to decide on the level of implementation. And sometimes if teachers are not familiar with this, if they haven't done a lot of progress monitoring, sometimes it's better just to start even with just one student. We encourage teachers to give it a try and implement with one student. So they might pick a student who has learning disabilities, who is at risk or a struggling reader to start and try it out. I think sometimes teachers are hesitant until they actually put this into practice. And then we see that teachers feel more positive about it. So you can start with an individual student. You could start with a small group. So perhaps you have a reading group that is a lower achieving reading group in your class. That might be a good group to start progress monitoring. It could even be that an entire grade level, so a level 4, or third grade, for instance, all of the teachers decide that they're going to monitor the progress of their students with learning disabilities in that grade. Or it could be an entire school decision that the school decides that all students with learning disabilities in their school will be progress monitored. But that's the first step. Usually a small team at the school level makes that decision. It's nice when you start progress monitoring and using this form of database decision making to have an administrative team that's leading the decision making. And that team, of course, would include teachers, would include specialists at the building, would include, of course, you know, many of you, principals at the building, to make decisions about how this should be implemented. So next, you're going to decide on which measures to use. So let me give you an example of some of the measures that we have available in reading. Measures vary just a little bit depending on the source of the measures. So there are lots of companies that provide measures that you can utilize. And some, I'm going to give you a couple of examples today of ways that you can get free or really low cost measures, but there are also lots of companies who have more elaborate systems, and you can spend a little bit of money per student and get access to some of these measures. So as we move into talking about measures for reading, I think it's important to go back again and talk a little bit about what these measures are, how they were developed, and what they show, I guess. So one, many of the measures, in fact, all of the measures I'm going to talk about today are timed. And you might have heard me mention earlier that they're typically 1 minute in length. I think sometimes then that makes people think that all that we're interested in is fast reading, but really we're interested in measures that can be delivered efficiently. I mentioned earlier, we don't want to ask teachers to be adding something to their daily routine that might take 30 minutes, for instance. But if I ask them to do something that might be 1 minute in length, that might be more acceptable. And so these measures are efficient to administer, but also they serve as overall indicators of academic competence. And this notion of CBM as an indicator is a really important one. This is sometimes difficult, I think, for teachers to wrap their head around. How could a 1 minute measure possibly give us the kind of information we need? And so it's important to help with understanding of how these measures serve as overall indicators. A 1 minute measure of oral reading, for instance, when we look at how that measure compares to other types of reading outcomes, we find that students who score higher are also better at decoding, they're better at comprehending, they're better at sight vocabulary, and we also see really strong correlations with high stakes tests that are given later in the year. So like national or state exams that are provided. There's lots of research to show that even though these measures are very short in duration, so 1 minute, they provide a great indication of how students are doing in reading, of students' proficiency in reading. So it's just very important to think more about this notion of the CBM progress monitoring score as an indicator. So to compare these indicators in CBM to other health indicators, sometimes we compare it to temperature and degrees. So many of you are probably taking your temperature a little more often, or as you go into businesses, they're taking your temperature. That temperature serves as an indicator of your wellness, just like CBM serves as an indicator of a student's reading wellness. Weight in pounds is a good indicator of overall health, just like CBM serves as an indicator of academic proficiency. A litmus test serves as an indicator of a solution's acidity, just like CBM serves as that indicator of academic proficiency. So if you're taking your temperature and your temperature is escalated, it's an indicator to you that something's wrong with your health, but we don't know yet what it is. It might be a flu or cold. Hopefully it's not something more significant like measles or tonsillitis, but that heightened temperature is an indicator that your health is not where it needs to be. In the same way, CBMs, curriculum-based measures, serve as indicators of a child's overall academic health. If CBM, and in this case, I've given you example, number of words read aloud in 1 minute is low, it might be an indicator that something isn't right with a student's academic health. We don't know if they need more practice on phonics or comprehension or fluency, but it gives us an indication as a teacher that I need to work on something else. So in this way, it serves as a nice indicator of academic health for our students with learning disabilities. So how does temperature and weight, or looking at acidity of a solution, how does that relate to monitoring academic skills? Well, we want a graph of educational health or educational strength. But what do we measure? We've talked a little bit about measuring weight and temperature, but of course we can't use those to monitor academic health. So we want to find measures that are good indicators of a student's educational health. And we want them to have those characteristics like temperature or weight. We want it to be something that's valid. We want it to be something that's efficient to give. So we have to identify those measures. It should be, we hope, fairly inexpensive and easy to administer. We want something that's sensitive to change. A lot of our students with learning disabilities are making growth, but sometimes that growth is not at the same rate as their peers. So we need a measure that can help us understand if a student is growing or not. And a student might be growing at a rate that's much lower than his or her peers. And we want to be able to capture that with that measure. The measures should be easy to understand, and we need them to serve as indicators of educational health. So we do lots of work in research to identify these measures that will, we do lots of studies of reliability, validity, sensitivity, to be able to say that these measures are indicators of educational health. It's important to note the measures do tell us if our teaching is effective. They don't tell us necessarily what to teach. So these quick measures are not, this isn't everything you're going to teach. This is just a quick little check-in, a quick, sometimes we call it the quick little like blood pressure check for a student, you know, hey, how are you doing in reading? You know, how's it going? Just like you would take your blood pressure in the doctor's office. It's a quick little check-in to see, is the student on track? Is the student making growth in reading? Okay. So here are some examples of different types of measures. I've listed some measures in reading, math, and writing. And as I mentioned, I'm going to kind of show you some of the measures in reading in particular. But if you're interested in mathematics or writing or science and social studies measures, I'm happy to provide some follow-up information to you about those measures. I'm going to focus on reading and pre-reading measures today, including early literacy measures, oral reading fluency, and MAIS. And I'm going to give you some examples of those. Some of you may have used these types of measures before. Maybe you called them something else, like maybe you call it formative assessment. Maybe you call it common assessments. But this will just kind of give you a sense of some of these measures that I've been discussing. Before we take a look at the measures, I just want to emphasize that standardization and consistency are really important. These measures have norms that we use to set goals for students, but those norms are only good if we're consistent in administration, in scoring, if we use measures that have documented reliability and validity. So sometimes teachers will say, well, I made a bunch of measures I want to use. If they don't have documented reliability and validity, then we can't be confident about the use of those measures. So we need to have that consistency and that that reliability, validity to assure that we have confidence in the data that we're collecting. So the next step is to determine what measure and at what level you're going to use. If you were collecting initial data, typically in most systems, you would give, I've suggested here 3, it could be 2, so 2 to 3 screening passages, and then you use the mean or the median to determine that initial benchmark or baseline level. This is sort of how you start your goal setting for students. You set the goal, and then you would administer 1 measure a week following setting that goal. So if you were going to start this, you know, if a teacher was going to start next week, I have some suggestions of places to get some of these measures, and teachers would start by collecting and setting an initial benchmark level. They would set a goal, and then they would start to monitor progress weekly. And I'll show you a graph in just a little bit so you can get a sense of what the graph looks like. So just a reminder to mute if you come on to the call, just to help others who are on the call. Thank you. Okay, so some common reading measures in CBM reading include things like letter naming fluency, letter sounds, nonsense word fluency. Most of these measures are delivered for 1 minute. These are a few examples of some of those measures. So letter naming fluency, this is for early reading. Students would name letters in 1 minute. You can see on this example, there are both upper and lowercase letters. And sometimes the font on some of these measures is different than the font that students would be typically exposed to. And so you might have to work a little bit just to find some examples or some progress monitoring tools that have the font that you feel like students would be most familiar with. Another thing you can do is just alert them. Like sometimes we just say like, oh, that T looks a little funny, like it's got that little tail on the end. So just remember when we see that, that's a T, and we'll, you know, practice a little bit so that when they see it, they're not surprised. The data that would be graphed by the teacher in this case would be the number of letters named correctly in 1 minute. So every week, students would receive a progress monitoring measure like this, and then they would individually administer, the teacher would individually administer, and the data that would be graphed is number of letters named correctly in 1 minute. It's very important that you first try to identify measures that are existing, that have already been developed and vetted. You shouldn't try to develop your own measures. Even though I know this just looks like a random page of letters, these measures are created in very important ways. They're statistically analyzed. So even though it may seem like, oh, I can put letters on a page, it's very important that you utilize measures that have been validated. Here's another measure. This is a similar measure, except for this measure, students would say, for 1 minute, would say sounds. So they would point to each letter and say the sound that that letter makes. We ask students to name the most common sound, so even though C, for instance, makes several sounds in the English language, we would ask them to say K for C, because it is the most common sound in the English language. This is another example. This is nonsense word fluency. This is a great decontextualized way to look at how students understand decoding words using sounds. Students can either say each sound like t, v, or they can say the whole word, tav. They get credit for each sound they say. So for 1 minute, they move across and they say sounds in the words that they see. This is a great example of what I mentioned earlier, that we're using these measures as a great way to monitor progress, but we're not necessarily using these measures as what to teach. Do I want to teach nonsense words? No, I don't want to teach students nonsense words. Is it a great decontextualized way to assess decoding? Yes. So it's just the difference between this is the quick assessment, this is the quick indicator, but it's not what we'll teach necessarily. In some cases, like in phonemic awareness, we are teaching students to segment words, but in other cases like nonsense word, we certainly don't want to teach how to read nonsense words necessarily. This is an example of phoneme segmentation fluency. For this measure, the teacher actually says the word and then the student says all the sounds in the word. As the student says sounds, the teacher marks on a sheet like this, underlining correct sounds and then putting a little slash through incorrect sounds. And so in this way, the teacher gets the number of correct sound segments for 1 minute, and that's the number that would be graphed. Oral reading fluency is probably the most common measure and the most validated measure. In oral reading fluency, we can use this actually for student, and just a reminder, if you jump on, if you could mute right away, I appreciate it. Oral reading fluency is for use with students in any grade, really, who, especially students who have learning disabilities. Students read aloud from a passage for 1 minute. This could be a passage that's at their grade, or it could be a passage that's at their instructional level. A good rule of thumb on that is that if the student's instructional level is more than 2 grades below their grade level. So if they are at grade level 5 in the US, 5th grade, but they're reading at a 3rd grade level, you actually would bump down and use 3rd grade level material. If they're just reading 1 grade level below, so if they're at grade 5 but reading at a 4th grade level, you would stick with their grade level material. So if they're more than 2 or more grade levels different on their instructional level, you might actually use lower reading material. For students with learning disabilities, we want to use materials that we feel like successfully capture their progress. And so we want to try to find that level that we really can use to get some good data on student progress. If we use a level that's way too difficult, we run the risk that we'll see sort of flat progress because the measures are too hard. So it is a little bit more of an art than a science, trying to find that just right level. But I'm happy to provide a little more follow-up on that if you have questions about that. This is how we score these measures. So typically, you would want to look at the scoring directions for the materials you're using, but typically repetitions, self-corrections, insertions are all scored as correct. It's a little bit different than when we do like a reading inventory or a running record. we count, you know, in some cases the scoring might be a little bit different, but typically for CBMs, these are the things that are counted correct. And then if students mispronounce, substitute a word, omit a word, they hesitate for 3 seconds or more, or if they reverse a word, those are counted as errors. So this is an example of a teacher copy of a passage. You can see that the main difference between the teacher copy is that down the right-hand side, the passage is numbered according to the running total of the number of words in the passage. So in this total passage, there are 348 words, but there are 12 words in that first sentence. That's for ease in scoring later. This is an example of the student copy that the student receives, and you can see that that does not have those numbers down the side. As the student reads aloud for 1 minute, the teacher listens and puts a slash, and you can see those slashes in red, puts a slash through any words that the student says incorrectly. So you can see here that as the student was reading through, the student actually missed 7 words. There were some words that were said incorrectly. Instead of plopped, he said propped. Instead of dismal, he said, what did he say? I'm trying to think. I think that he just didn't know that word. He wasn't familiar. And so he waited 3 seconds and then just moved on and didn't do that word. Instead of mom, he said mother. I know sometimes that's a little tricky because that is a replacement that we feel like is similar. But in the case of CBMs, we actually need to just say the word that is listed. You know, there's no, even though that's like an okay replacement, we have to read the word that's listed. So in this case, the student read 80 words, but had 7 errors. And so the number that would be graphed would be 73 words read correctly. So once a week, a teacher would provide a passage like this. Each week, the passage would be different. And then the number graph would be the number of correct words read in 1 minute. Another example of a CBM measure for older students could be actually used with students in grades 1 through 12. Would be maze, a maze passage. This is kind of like, some of you might be familiar with a cloze technique, C-L-O-Z-E, or you might be familiar with this maze technique where for every few words, there's a word either omitted or a choice of words, and students have to read through the passage and use the context of the passage to help select the word that fits in the sentence. Generally, this measure is 1 minute. With some systems, it can be up to 3 minutes. The benefit of a measure like maze is that this is one of the only reading measures you can actually administer in a group fashion. So a teacher could pass this out, give the directions, set the timer, and then the students would work on it for the time, either 1 or up to 3 minutes. The teacher collects this after and then scores it later and enters those scores into the graph. So if you had a lot of students with learning disabilities with whom you needed to monitor progress, this might be a good alternative. Here's an example of a scored passage. The teacher used the scoring key to move through and put an X through any that were incorrect. And then the teacher counts up the number of correct answers or correct choices the student made to graph that score. I've been promising some examples of where you can access more materials. I've given here one that is free. So Acadience, if you go to this link, you can download the materials. You might have to set up like a free account, like just enter a username and password, but then you can download PDF materials of the administration directions, reading materials. They also have mathematics materials. So Acadience is a good place to go to get free materials. Dibbles, which is housed at the University of Oregon, is a very low cost set of materials. Those materials are $1 per student per year. And I believe you also get some graphing tools as part of the Dibbles. But I encourage you to go to intensiveintervention.org. I mentioned this website earlier. That's the National Center on Intensive Intervention, to get a better sense of the variety of materials that are out there. I've just provided a couple that I know are free or low cost just for you to take a look at. And honestly, if you were starting, I would start with something that's free or low cost, and maybe start with just 1 or 2 students just to kind of get a sense of what it might look like. So this is, I'll leave this up just for a minute, but this is just kind of a little worksheet to give you kind of a sense of how you would get started. It's just something you could kind of fill in to get going, I guess, if you will, to sort of guide you through those first steps. And as I mentioned, we're not going to have as much time as I'd like to talk about database decision making. You know, typically that's like that's the next talk, I guess. Maybe you'll have me back and I can talk more about database decision making. But it is the most important aspect of collecting this data. You set goals and graph that data, and then use decision-making rules to make important decisions about how students are doing. So to set goals, you can either use established norms or benchmarks that are part of the systems that you're using. So if you look in Acadience or Dibbles, for instance, they have established norms. And when I say norms, I mean like they'll say things like, in the fall, students at grade 4 are typically achieving at this level, and they'll provide the level at which the students across the US are achieving at that point. It could be that instead you use weekly rates of improvement. And so for progress monitoring, you might use what's called ROI, or rates of improvement. I'll give you a couple of examples of what those look like. Okay, I'll go back to that in just a minute, but here's an example of norms. These are a little bit old, but these were taken from students across the US. This was over 100,000 students. This is the number of words read per minute. That's WPM, words per minute. In grade 4, the expectation in the spring would be 125 words per minute. This is an example of weekly rates of improvement. So we would hope generally that students in grade 2 would grow 1.5 words per minute. So that's how you would set your goal. You would use that weekly rate of improvement, or you would use the spring rate of improvement to set a goal at the end of the time that you'll be working with the student. Again, you know, you might set goals. Typically in the US, we set goals for the entire school year. So right now, school is starting around this area, and teachers will set goals for May of this year. They would set a goal that many weeks out. It depends a little bit on your school structure and your school system to make decisions about what that goal setting would look like for your students. This is an example of a graph. This is Rodney's reading graph. You can see at the beginning those few data points at the start right around here. That's his baseline data. This black line is the goal that was set for Rodney. And then this data that you can see that's sort of red is the data, the weekly data that is captured for Rodney. And so a teacher would look at this data and be using a decision-making rule to make decisions about how Rodney's doing. You can see this dotted line indicates the teacher looked at his data points, saw that there were 5 data points below the goal line, and then actually implemented an intervention change. So this is an example of how you would set that goal using benchmarking data. I can send a PDF of these slides to Manila also to distribute so that you have these slides for your reference for later. And I guess it's on YouTube too, so you'll have access to it there. So these are the basic steps that we've gone through. I'm just going to finish up. I'm kind of wary of our time. We've just got a couple of minutes left here. I'm just going to finish up with a slight bit about decision making. So here's some of the important questions we're asking as we look at our graph data. So think back to Rodney's graph. I just showed you Rodney's graph. We would ask questions like, is the student progressing compared to his goal? Is my instruction effective? Do I need to change instruction? And then, is my change effective? We saw for Rodney's graph, the teacher implemented a change, but now I'd want to continue to ask, is that change effective? Or in the best possible case, should I actually raise the student's goal? A great way to think about student progress is to think about the trend line of the data. So we would implement a trend line, insert a trend line into Rodney's data. If the trend is below the goal, we would change instruction. If the trend is above the goal, we would raise the goal. If the trend is the same as the goal, we would just stay the course. And finally, I haven't talked a lot about intervention changes today. That's actually a different piece to this. But as we think about different changes that can be made for students with learning disabilities, I would say these changes are really broad. Like, these aren't as specific as each student would need, but this gives you kind of a start, a sense of the different types of changes that we might start thinking about for students with learning disabilities if the data indicates that we need to make a change. So we go back to here, okay, change instruction. Now, what do I do next? We go maybe to one of these things or to a different evidence-based instructional intervention. And you can find more of those interventions also on that intensiveintervention.org website. So we talked a little bit about CBM and progress monitoring. We didn't talk enough about data utilization, but that could be maybe a next time I speak with you. My email is here. If you have other questions, I'm happy to follow up. And I've seen the chat kind of blinking as I've gone along, so I'll do my best to answer any questions as well that you've posted in the chat. So I hope it's helpful for you, and I'm happy to follow up with additional resources. And I just really appreciate all of your time, especially as I know it's probably after the workday for most of you. So thank you again so much.
Thank you, Dr. Erica. It was such a wonderful session. So much clarity in whatever you have discussed with us, especially on CBM and progress monitoring. I request Dakshani Madam to take a couple of questions with Dr. Erica.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Erica. It was a very enlightening session, and I've got some wonderful comments for you in the chat box.
Great.
Enjoyed the session, and a lot of insights and lot of understanding have come with that. There were a couple of questions which I would like you to answer. Is it possible?
Sure. Yes, of course.
So, there was one question we talked about the initial years. They said, is there a test required for everyone? Any particular reason for screening everybody? Is it not enough only from grade, ages 3 to 7 was the question. So they just wanted to understand if.
Yeah, I think typically we use screening in when they start at school age. And so like ages 5 on up. To be honest, there are earlier measures that we can use that are even in preschool or even actually down to birth. But those measures haven't been studied quite as much. The preschool measures a little bit more. In preschool, we're thinking about things like picture naming, alliteration, but typically the measures that I spoke about today, we're starting at age 5 when they're in school age. And then we're actually screening students all the way up through their high school time if they have struggles in reading, if they have learning disabilities, we continue to follow and screen them. Once you get into like middle and high school, so like grades, 7 through 12, we're not maybe screening everyone. We're using existing test data, for instance, in that screening process for those students who are the oldest. So I hope that answers. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
The second one is, are the tests are different for different students under different categories? What they're asking, Dr. Erica.
Sure, yeah. So I think you should identify the test or the measure that best fits with the skill needs of the student. So if a student is having difficulty with early reading, then you should use one of those measures of sounds or letters or phoneme segmentation. If the student is having difficulty is reading connected text, like maybe can read 2 or 3 sentences sort of slowly, then you should use oral reading fluency. You want to use the measure that's sort of most aligned with the next skill that they need to work on, if you will. If they're having more difficulty with comprehension, sometimes then we move to using the maze measure that I showed you, where they read along and select words out of the passage.
That was an excellent answer. And, they were all interesting activities which people can use. You have also given some websites from which we can download and then start using.
Yes, absolutely.
There is one more question.
Sure.
So children with learning disabilities, till what age or grade can we teach phonics? There is a question from Sunita.
Sure. Yeah. So I think for students with learning disabilities, if they have a learning disability in reading, it's likely that they're going to need help with phonics. And so we want to start in those earliest grades, like if they're identified, at 2nd or 3rd grade, that's fairly common in the US that they would be identified when they're about maybe 8 to 9 years old. I'm not sure in India what that timeline looks like, but at that point we would make sure actually, like, it's very likely that prior to even their identification, they've been working on phonemic awareness and phonics, and that work may need to continue into their time, when they're 9 and 10 years old, even though that's typically a time when we really start working on oral reading and reading fluency. Some of our students with learning disabilities may still need that phonics practice. And it's important that we provide that because those are really the building blocks, the foundation of what they need to be better readers later in life.
Thank you so much, Dr. Erica. There is another question that follows here.
Sure.
Says, our NEP encourages home language or mother tongue for the first few years of development. In fact, it says they have to be taught in that language. What
Okay.
sorts of adjustments are made for students whose native language is not English, especially when it comes to learning English?
Yeah, sure. So typically in the studies that have been done on progress monitoring with non-native, in our case, non-native English speakers, but we'll go with non-native language speakers or home language speakers. The data is not that different in how whether those measures are administered, for instance, or they take the measures in their home language versus in English, for instance. I think it depends a little bit on what the focus will be in the classroom. So eventually, if a teacher is hoping that a student will move to speaking English in the classroom, then the teacher may want to gradually start progress monitoring in English, but it's fine to, if your NEP standards suggest that you should be, students should be taught in their home language, it's fine to start progress monitoring in that language as well. The trick will be finding materials, that are in that home language. So it's a little bit difficult. We have lots of materials, for instance, in the US that are translated into Spanish as an example, but I think the difficulty might be in identifying materials that can be utilized for students in their home language.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Erica. Thank you very much for answering all the questions. Now that you have shared your mail ID, some of the principals may reach out to you directly.
Please, yes.
Yes, they will reach out to you so you can clarify their doubt. And thank you so much on behalf of Bangalore Sahodaya School Complex Association for starting the day with us.
Yes.
You have
it was
lovely
a great
day.
start. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for hosting me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All
You
right.
so much. It was such a
Thank
wonderful
you.
and informative session, and we got a lot of positive messages for you in the chat
good.
box. Yes, and we had another 100 plus watching you on YouTube as well.
Oh, that's great. That's
so
terrific.
It was such a lovely session. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Erica. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and if you could send me the chat, that'll help too with answering some follow-up questions.
I will do that. I will copy it, and then I'll send it to Mrs. Manila, and she will be forwarding it to you.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, dear participants, for being with us this evening. Thank you very much.